Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the book of Chronicles, the Sefer Divrei Hayamim. We are right now about to study together Chronicles 1, chapter 9. This is the final chapter, and I'm sure many of you are relieved that we're nearing the end of these long lists of names. This would be the last one. Again, remember, the purpose and point of this genealogy is to give the people that are returning to the land of Israel to rebuild it after the exile, the Babylonian exile, to give them encouragement and to give them a sense of their place in the history. Which makes this important, similar to someone sitting, at the beginning of a new, an important juncture in a family history, telling their child, this is where your grandparents came from, this is my life, to give the child a sense for their place and what, to encourage them to move forward and continue that legacy. So even though it can be somewhat tedious to read all these names, you have to put yourself in the place of the people that were listening to this and learn those important lessons, that we are all a part of this long arc of history that started long, long ago and goes many, many, many years into the future. So, V'chol Yisrael, this is verse 1. The emphasis that has been repeated over the last 8 chapters is encapsulated in these 2 words. All of Israel, deliberately choosing the term Yisrael, which is a term which has been used repeatedly, even when referring to Yaakov, to the father, to the forefather, the patriarch Jacob. He used his name Yisrael in order to include all of the tribes of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, including the people from Judah, from all the other tribes, all of Israel. Hitzachsu, they all found their lineages, their genealogies, and they were all listed. Vinam Ksuvim, and where are they written? They are written, I'll say, from Machi Yisrael v'Yehuda, in the Chronicles, in the books of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, and Haglu, Machi Yisrael, in the book, in the kings of Israel, of all the kings of Israel, v'Yehuda, and I put the comma in the wrong place, I apologize. However, Yehuda, Judah, Haglu leBavel b'Ma'alam, they were exiled to Babylon because of their rebellion against God. With that, Divrei Hayamim, the book of Chronicles, is not interested in the various wars and the political machinations and the political blunders back and forth that led to the destruction of the kingdom of Judah. It's only interested in the fact that because they rebelled against God, therefore they were exiled. So the kings of Israel were chosen when this guy wanted to talk about all the genealogies of everyone. But then, because at the end, it all ended with the exile of Judah, because Israel, the other tribes, had already been destroyed by the Assyrians, which was discussed in earlier chapters. So it was Yehuda, it was the kingdom of Judah that was sent into exile because of their rebellion against God. V'hayoshvim harishonim asher ba'achuz asam, and those who were the first to settle in their back into their lands. So now it's talking about to the returnees. It's talking about those that have returned due to the decree of Cyrus, of King Cyrus of Persia, and under the leadership of the early leaders, the Zerubbabel, who we mentioned in previous chapters, and Yoshua, the high priest, and eventually in Ezra and Nehemiah, those leaders, the early ones that came, that resettled in their inheritances, in the lands that they was genealogically theirs. The land where their families had been before the exile were Yisrael, were people of Israel, HaKohanim, HaLeviim, and they also included priests and Levites, VahaNetinim, and also the Netinim. The Netinim were a group of people who traditionally they're assumed to be those that descended from the Givonim, those that converted under Joshua into Judaism under suspicious circumstances, but eventually they became guardians. Well, not really guardians. They became servants of the temple, supplying it with wood and supplies, etc. These were the Netinim. Eventually, over time, the Netinim assimilated into the Jewish people. If we look in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we discussed this a bit. The status of the Netinim. But regardless, so the bottom line of this verse is the early arrivals included everyone. So no group can say we were the first to come. It included Israelites, priests, Levites, and Netinim. Everyone were from the early arrivals. Sometimes people say, well, my grandfather, he came first. No, of these groups, all of them came originally to resettle the land of Yerushalayim Yashvu, and in Jerusalem itself, the city of Jerusalem, in the capital itself, was settled by Min Bnei Yehuda, from children of Judah, Min Bnei Binyamin, and from Benjaminites, Min Bnei Ephraim and Manasseh, and from descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. We see that there were others from other tribes that had been exiled with Judah and returned with Judah. That's a theme that repeatedly comes up in Divrei Hayamim. Utai ben Amihud ben Amri ben Imri ben Bani min bnei Peretz ben Yehuda. These were some of the families that settled in Judah. That was verse 4. Min Ashiloni Asoyah ha-Bechor ubanav, and from the Shilonites, that included Asayah, the firstborn, and his children. These are all descendants of Judah. Yeuel v'acheim sheish me'os v'tishim, and their brothers, there were 690 of them that came back. Umin b'nei Binyamin, and from the Benjaminites that came back, because we just said some of Judahites settled in Jerusalem, but it's from Benjamin also. Shalu ben Meshulam ben Hodavia ben Hasenuah, V'yivniya ben Yerocham, Ve'ela ben Uzi ben Michri. All of these were the sons of Uzi, the son of Michri, Meshulam ben Shaphatya ben Ruel ben Yivniya. These are all names. Again, as my pattern in the previous 8 chapters, I'm not going to translate each one. V'achem, and their brothers, and their family members, their brothers, Litolosam, according to their family histories, Tishame Os v'chamishim v'shisha. They amounted to 956. Kol Ela Anoshim, all of these were men, Rashi Avos, that were the heads of families, Lebeis Avosiyam, according to their families. So we have Judahites and Benjaminites coming back to be from the original settlers of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. And from the priests, Yedaiah, V'Hoyariv, V'Yachin, Va'azariah ben Chilkiah ben Meshulam ben Tzadok ben Merayot ben Achitov Negid Beit Elohim, who was the chief officer of the house of God. So probably means Negid is just another title for the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, because we're talking about now the priests that settled in Jerusalem. Va'adaya ben Yerocham ben Pashhor ben Malkiyahu, Masai ben Adiel ben Yachzera ben Meshulam ben Mishilemit ben Imer. These were more priests and their who they descended from. V'achem, and their brothers, Rashim Levei Tavosam, also heads of families. Elef u'shvameos v'shishim, they included a number of 1,760 Giborei Chayil, that were men of usually Giborei Chayil is referring to Giborei Chayil here. Usually it's referring to men of war, men of might, of power, but here they were men of strength, melechet avodat beit Elohim, in order to do the work of the service in the temple of God. So again, they were called Giborei Chayil, although their job was to serve in the temple as they were priests. So now that we mentioned the priests that settled in Jerusalem, now we're going to mention the Levites that settled in Jerusalem. Umin Halavim, and from the Levites, Shemaiah ben Chashuv ben Azrikam ben Chashavia min bnei Merari. They were from the clan that descended from Merari, one of the 3 sons of Levi himself. Uvak Bakar Cheresh v'Galol, another 3 people, Matanya ben Micha ben Zichri ben Asaph. Interestingly, Asaph being a descendant of Korach. V'Ovadia ben Shemaiah ben Golol ben Yedusun, Uverechia ben Asa ben Elkanah Hayoshev b'Chatzrei Netofati, who lived in the Chatzerot is sometimes translated as courtyards, but in this context, it means in the small surrounding villages around the larger city of Netofat, right? So, or Netofa. So this Elkanah had lived in those areas. V'hashoarim, and the shoarim, those that were in charge of the gates. Remember, one of the jobs of the Levites was the two primary jobs of the Levites was to lead the singing and the prayer in the temple, and they were also the shoarim. They were the guardians of the gates to make sure that they were opened and closed at the proper times in the proper way and ceremony, and to guard the gates, make sure that people coming in were the right people, etc. So v'ashoarim Shalom v'Yaakov v'Talmon v'Achiman. These were the four gatekeepers. V'Achihem, and their brothers were Shalom Harosh. The head was Shalom. Shalom was the head of these four brothers, so they were the four ones in the four different directions. The entrances ways on the sides of the temple area. V'Adheina, and until now, Bishar HaMelech Mizracha, they were in the King's Gate, exactly where this is on the east side, who knows. But they were the gatekeepers for the camps of the Levites. Vishalom ben Koreh ben Eviasaph ben Korach, and Shalom, who is a descendant of Korach, Ve'elchav and his brothers, Lebeis Aviv, according to his father's family, HaKorchim, those that descended from Korach. Amaleches Avoda, they were in charge of the work in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. Shomrei HaSipim LaOhel, they were the guardians of the Sipim, is the doorway or the threshold towards the Ohel, towards the temple. Vavotehem, and their forefathers, Al Machaneh Adonai Shomrei Hamavo, they were guards of the camp of God. Machaneh, so this is referring to back in the Mishkan, back in the desert times, right? They were the guardians of the entranceway there. So they went all the way back to the time in the desert, even before the first temple was built, just giving them a place in the long arc of Jewish history. Pinchas ben Elazar, and Pinchas, the son of Elazar, right? As we know, so he was the grandson of Aaron, and then his son Elazar, and then his son Pinchas, the Pinchas of biblical fame. Nagid haya alehem lefanim Adonai himo. He was in charge over them, right? He was the appointed to be the boss, I guess, over the Levites who were watching the gates. So because he was the Kohen Gadol, he was the high priest, and God was with him. This is just a quick reference. Again, we have very few biographical details in these genealogies, but it's trying to point out that Pinchas was regarded special by God. We know that he was, his specialness from at Briti Shalom, God gave him his covenant of peace. So he had that special Hashem Imo, God was with him, and he was in charge of the Levites, I guess, making sure they do their jobs and making sure the staffing was right and the shifts were right, etc., or whatever it was that he had to do. Zechariah ben Meshalemia, and Zechariah, the son of Meshalemia, Sho'er Pesach L'Ol Moed. He was the gatekeeper at the entrance of the Ohel Moed. Ohel Moed, again, is reference to the Mishkan times, the tabernacle times, the tabernacle being the focus of worship of God prior to the building of the temple, which was used in the desert before the coming into the settling the land of Israel, and then eventually in Shiloh as well within the land of Israel until the temple was built by Solomon, the permanent temple. Kulam haberurim l'shoarim basipim, all who were chosen to be gatekeepers to watch over the thresholds of the entranceways. Mosai Mushne Masa, there were in total 212 people. Hema b'chatzreim misyachsam, each one were their genealogies, their family origins were listed out according to their chatzrehem, the places where they dwelled, they lived. Hema Yisad David Shmuel Haroa be'emunasam, and David and Shmuel, so here we're now moved along in history to the descendants of those that worked in the Ohel Moed, in the days in the wilderness. So, but when David and Shmuel were getting ready to establish the temple, right? David didn't build a temple; his son Solomon did, but David got everything lined up and ready to roll. And Samuel was the prophet. The Shmuel HaRoah, Shmuel the seer, was the literal translation of the, which we do occasionally call a prophet, a roah, a seer. That's S-E-E-R. So when they established these groups, these people, based on their family lineages and history, be'emunasam, in their trust, in other words, in the office, in their trustworthy positions. So they established them and put them there to be in those positions. Vehemu b'neim, and they and their children, ala sha'arim, were appointed over the gates, lebeis Adonai, in the temple of God, lebeis ha'olam mishmaros, and they were the temple of God, which is the house of the tent, meaning the temple of God, the Beit HaMikdash, is the descendant and the replacement and equal to the house of the tent, which is what was wandered before the Beit HaMikdash was thing, lemishmaros, according to their their shifts. This or as guards could be another translation, but I think the right way, according to their shifts. The gatekeepers were on all four directions: Mizrach to the east, Yama to the west, Safona to the north, Venegman to the south. And their brothers within their small villages, Lavo l'shivat hayamim me'es el es im eila. They were came. Sometimes they would come. In other words, even though these were the families that lived in Jerusalem, the ones that lived outside of Jerusalem, the families that lived in those other towns, they would come occasionally for 7-week visits, me'es el es, from time to time, im eila, to join their brethren that were in Jerusalem. Kiva emunema. Because the four strong, powerful, mighty gatekeepers were trustworthy. Heim halavim, they were the Levites. V'hayu al halishachos, and they also were appointed over the storerooms. The lishachos are the storerooms that were built around the temple, where the temple supplies were kept. The al ha'otzaros, Beisolim, and on the treasuries, the storehouses of the temple of God. So the lishachos were directly surrounding the temple on the Temple Mount. There were rooms in which each one had a specific function, and they were guarded by the Levium as well, by the Levites as well. The otzros, storehouses, were presumably maybe not exactly on the temple, but they were just places in Jerusalem near the temple, which were designated as storerooms for temple supplies. Usivos Beisolim Yolinu, they would sleep and live and reside around, in buildings around the house of God, around the temple, Kialeam Mishmeres, because it was their responsibility to do the guarding. They were the ones that were in charge of the keys every single morning to make sure that it was open. Umehem, and from them, they were in charge of Aklei Avoda, to take care of the temple vessels, right? The supplies. Kiva Mispar Yavium, because they were counted as they were brought in, with Mispar Yotzium, and they were counted as they were taken out. In other words, whenever they were put away, they made sure they had 102 of whatever, and when they took them out, they make sure they had the right amount, in order to make sure people wouldn't steal or take, and so on and so forth, and the upkeep if some of them went bad. Umehem emunim alakalim, and some of them were appointed on the vessels of the Mikdash, V'al kol klei HaKodesh, and on all of the vessels of the Mikdash of the temple. Just as we know from the tabernacle and the Torah, where they were responsible for taking care of and moving the vessels from place to place, so too here they were responsible. While it's not traveling as it was back then, they're responsible for the upkeep and guarding those vessels. V'halasolet, and they were, what else? The supplies, also the perishable supplies, like the flour, the yayin, the wine, v'hashemen, and the oil, v'halavona, v'habesamit. These are the spices that were necessary for the incense. And from the priestly families, they were members who were those that were compounded and crushed and mixed the spices for the ketoret, for the incense. Umatitya min halavim, and Matitya, who was one of the Levites, who habachar, he was the firstborn, l'shalom hakorchi, from Shalom, who descended from Korach, be'amuna al maseh chavitim. He was entrusted with the job of making the chavitim. A chavita, as often now in modern Hebrew, it kind of means like a pancake or anything fried and flat. Of the menachot, right, of the karbanot mincha, the flour offerings, some of them are required to be brought as flat cakes that were fried. And so he was in charge of that, of the frying. And from the descendants of Kehat, some of the members of the Kehat clan of the Levites, they were in charge of the bread that was used for on the shulchan, on the showbread, the table of the showbread, la'achin Shabbat, to prepare and bake it each and every week. So while the first 8 chapters we focused mostly on people's jobs in terms of, well, not jobs, their tasks in terms of settling various towns and cities, we talked about carpenters and craftsmen that set up the economy and so on of the entire people. Now we're focusing, this chapter 9, we're focusing on the people and the families who were resuming their familial jobs that had been in their families for generations before, all the way back to the early times in the wilderness, that would pertain to the specific avoda, the specific service in the Beit HaMikdash, all the way from the guards to the incense compounders to the bakers, etc. And now we're going to focus on the singers, and these were the people that would sing. Rashi Avot LaLeviim, the heads of the Levite families, Balishachot Piturim, they would remain in the lishachot, in those rooms that we talked about before that were on the Temple Mount, right? Some of those rooms were for sleeping, were for residences, and they were exempted. In other words, exempted from all these other jobs, right? Ki yomam v'layla alehem b'malacha, because their job of singing was constant, day and night, even in the night when the burning of the offering leftovers was done. That was part of the service itself, and it was accompanied by singing, at least according to this verse. That would be the what it seems like. And because they were constantly switching out the singers, so that the singing and the prayer should go on all the time, therefore they were exempted from the other work. The work of baking, the work of guarding, the work of crushing spices, etc., etc. These were the heads of the families of the Levites according to their families. These were the heads of the families, and they resided in Jerusalem. And now we're going to kind of zero in on another family before we complete the end of the genealogies. Uvegivon, and in the city of Givon, Yashu Avi Givon, the founder of the city, or the big leader of the city of Givon, was a man named Yeiel v'shem Ishto Ma'acha. We'll learn in a minute why we're mentioning this specific family. And his wife's name was Ma'acha. Uvno habachor Avdon v'tzur v'kish uval v'ner v'nadav. And his son, these were his sons. Ugidar v'achyo uZechariah Miklos, these were other sons. Umiklos holid et Shimam. Miklot had a child named Shimam. V'yaf heim neged achehem yashru v'Yerushalayim im and they also lived together with their brethren in Jerusalem with their brethren. This was a family of Benjaminites. Again, why we're picking them, we'll see in a minute. Remember, one of the sons was named Kish, right? One of the sons of this couple, the founder of Givon, Yeiel, and his wife Ma'acha, was a guy named Kish, right? Now V'ner, and another one of his sons was Ner, right? And Ner had a son named Kish. Apparently the name Kish was popular in this family. So V'ner holid et Kish, and Ner had a son named Kish. V'Kish holid et Shaul, and Kish was gave birth to his son Shaul, Saul. V'Shaul and Saul holid et Yehonatan, had a child named Yehonatan, v'et Malkishua, v'et Avinatav, v'et Eshboal. So Ben Yehonatan, and the son of Yonatan was Merivbaal, or Merival, Holidet Micha. In previous chapters, we talked a little bit about these names and the fact that there was idolatry in their names, but we discussed that in prior podcasts. Uvnei Micha Piton v'Melach v'Tachreya v'Achaz Holidet Yara, and Achaz had a child named Yara, v'Yara Holidet Alamet, v'et Azmavet, v'et Zimri, v'Zimri Holidet Motza, v'Motza Holidet Bina. These are again giving the family of Saul and how he descended from Kish and all of his cousins and so on and so forth. Umotza Holidet Bino, Rufaya Bino, El Asa Bino, Atzel Bino, his Atzel Shisha Banim, and Atzel had 6 sons, Ve'elash Mosam, and these were their names: Azrikam, Bochru, V'Yishmael, Usha'arya, V'Ovadia, V'Chanan, Ela B'nei Atzel. So the purpose of all of this was really to give us, to zero in on one specific family, and that was the family that from which Shaul, the first king of Israel, descended. Shaul being an important person in the history, and therefore it was important for the chronicler to mention his family history and where they settled and so on. And now that we have the King Shaul, the chronicler is done with all of his histories and genealogies, and he's going to go on to talk a little bit about the story of Shaul, but with a very different perspective than the perspective that we saw in the book of Samuel, which had many chapters on Shaul and his successes, his early successes in uniting the people and defending them against their enemies, and then eventually his failures, and it went into it in detail. Here, the chronicler really is not here to give a history of the stories. He's really to give focus on the history with a purpose. Everybody knows Shaul. You can go read the other books if you want to know the stories of his life. But I, the chronicler, in the next chapter, right, I'm going to tell you what you need to know about Shaul for this purpose. And, now as we come to rebuild the Second Temple and the message that I'm trying to convey. So this completes the 9 chapters of genealogies. I know it wasn't the most exciting, but I tried my best to point out how this is a genealogy with a purpose. Now the people are getting down to business. They're getting down to rebuilding. And the chronicler is going to give a narrative, a version of history, which is meant to guide the people to success on this mission, this incredibly important mission of resettling and rebuilding the land of Israel. Thank you so much for studying chapter 9 together with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 10 and, of course, the rest of this book of Chronicles together. Have a wonderful day.